Welcome to our very first press conference of the World Economic Forum on Africa 2017. My name is Oliver Cann. I'm with the public engagement team here at the forum. This session, I can't think of a better way to start a session which is predominantly all about the future of the African economy than to actually discuss in some great detail what are the major trends and drivers. We're here to announce the launch and discuss some of the highlights from the African Business Agenda 2017 report being put out by PwC. The theme and the title for this year is Changing Gear. There's going to be time for questions and answers, but I'm just going to ask our panel just to speak very briefly for 1 or 2 minutes each on a particular element of the report. So I'm just going to announce our panel first of all. To my immediate left is Hein, Boegman, the CEO of PwC Africa. And we have Anton van Wyk, Client and Markets Leader, same PwC Africa. Dion, Shango, you're the CEO of Southern Africa. We're moving through the regions rapidly here. Anne Eriksson, Regional Senior Partner, East Africa, PwC. Last but not least, Noel Albertus, representing Francophone Africa, Regional Senior Partner. I'm going to start with you, Hein, because you probably are a better place than almost anyone on this continent to discuss the feeling amongst CEOs about the business climate here in the region.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity, and I think the starting point for us is really the optimism that is out there in Africa, and perhaps the resilience displayed, in tough environments. You look at the South African position in the last month or so, the way business, labour, and to some extent government has been able to pull together to perhaps avert some of what was predicted as something that could potentially be a bigger slide than what has transpired. I think generally speaking, if you compare Africa 10 years to today, there's a resilience in terms of democracy and making sure that democracy and the rule of law applies more so than perhaps it had been, some decades ago. A tougher stance on crime and in particular on corruption and perhaps big business playing that role that says if you're not in an environment where we could do business with a set of rules that is internationally acceptable, it is unacceptable for us to do business in those parts of the world. So this publication perhaps then takes the CEO's view and perhaps some of the optimism that's displayed by Africa CEOs versus perhaps CEOs in some other global companies.
Anton, moving through the theme, which is changing gear, you're specifically interested in the elements of globalization and populism and protectionism. What can you tell me from the report that updates our thinking in these areas?
Well, I think just leading on from Hein, and maybe just an aside, I serve on the King Committee. I'm a member of the King Committee in South Africa, which writes our governance code here. And I think what is a key finding in the report, together what you just said, is also the whole aspect of trust and transparency that leaders need to exhibit. And what we have noticed is a lot of the CEOs now, in particular, focusing quite heavily on what the governance outcomes are with regard to their operations in Africa, their expansion efforts, their growth. And I think in embedding things like ethical culture, how do we measure performance? Is it good performance or bad on the continent? How strong are our controls to ensure that we measure up with what is happening globally from a control perspective? I think the key aspect is, as I said, is around transparency. So is the business that we're undertaking on the continent legitimate? We're not feeding a corrupt environment. We're seeing CEOs now becoming a lot more anti-corruption, asking the right questions, ensuring that there's rule of law in those countries that they operate in. And I think finally, the point that we notice as well is CEOs are becoming a lot more consultative, both with government as well as with their peers on the continent to ensure that they do meet the efforts, the globalization efforts that they would like to embody on this continent.
I just wanted to dwell on the theme, staying with you, Anton, briefly. The theme of the meeting is achieving inclusive growth through responsive and responsible leadership. And we chose that theme for a reason. It was a theme in Davos this year at our annual meeting. And we want to have that conversation here, but we're also accused at the World Economic Forum of being a talking shop. To what degree do you believe the message for responsive and responsible leadership is filtering through into the business community?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think also that in order for that to happen, I think and we've seen this certainly here in South Africa and in other countries in Africa, these forums that are developing to discuss things like knowledge, to discuss skill, both technical and soft skill, and what kind of skill do we need to ensure that we do operate in this economy of Africa. I think key on this continent are areas around experience and diversity. I think diversity is a massive point to your question. And I think finally, do we have the ability to actually implement our strategies on the continent to meet those expectations?
Dion, let's move on. I'm going to ask you what the top 3 risks are highlighted in this report.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Oliver. So in the report, we do ask CEOs to give us a view of the top risks, both from a macro perspective as well as an operational perspective. On the macro side, CEOs have listed uncertain economic growth as the top macro risk. Secondly, exchange rate volatility is something that they see as a top risk. And thirdly, on the macro side, social instability is something that keeps CEOs awake at night. And on the operational side, the top risk appears to be availability of key skills. And the interesting part about that response is that whilst it's well known that there are many people unemployed on the continent, it's really the very specific type of skills that CEOs are looking for that they are finding difficult to find on the employment market. Secondly, volatile energy costs is a risk that is fairly high on the agenda from an operational perspective. And then thirdly, believe it or not, cybersecurity threats as the world becomes more and more complex and connected, regardless of geography.
Fascinating, and actually it's striking to see the similarities in I'm thinking between this region and other regions in the world. Cybercrime, I know from our own global risk report, was the domain of just Japan and the US a couple of years ago, and it's everywhere now. It's really growing up onto the risk agenda. And let's move over to you, because you're on the East African side of the region. Give us your unique experiences from where you're based.
Okay, thanks, Cann. I think what CEOs are saying is that there are very specific areas where they see opportunities for expansion and growth. And Kenya in East Africa is one of them. And speaking to one of the risks and issues that Dion talked about, particularly around availability of skills and labor, I think it's fair to say that there's reasonable skills, well-educated skills in pockets of East Africa, Uganda, but particularly Kenya. So I think that coupled with the whole point of CEOs wanting a predictable environment is probably something that seems to appeal to CEOs who are looking to grow. But that's not to say that it's all, happy-go-lucky. There are challenges, but I think it's how does the private sector in particular play together to influence policy. And what I'm finding in our part of the world is that business in the private sector are actually taking it as their responsibility to come together and influence government policy and therefore the environment in which they want to operate.
We always think, possibly lazily, when we're looking at Africa from outside, that East Africa is the tech hub. It's where a lot of the innovation is coming from. Is that still holding true?
I think it's fair to say that, yeah, there's been quite a lot of very positive development in particularly telco and mobile, the whole financial services space, and very, incredible innovations that have, brought out previously unimagined products and services, particularly for the unbanked. And so we see big and small and medium organizations investing in the tech space, in new products that go down to really the grassroots. So it's not just for the white-collared people, but it's about really transforming lives of innovations that actually transform ordinary lives of people living in East Africa. And there are some notable innovations that we can quote.
And Noel, bring us up to speed on Francophone Africa. You're a regional senior partner. You're actually based in Morocco. This meeting is, particularly looking at sub-Saharan Africa. But give us your insights from Francophone sub-Saharan Africa, if you will.
So, globally, Francophone Africa in 2016 and the projection for 2017 are not so bad if you compare, with Anglophone Africa. The reason why is because Francophone Africa is less dependent of oil and gas, except Algeria in North Africa and DRC for mining industry. The other countries have less dependency of oil and gas. So they are more diversified. And the two magic words in this area is first integration. CEOs are asking for more integration because their markets are often, small or medium-sized markets. So they need to enlarge their market. They need to be more integrated. And at the minimum, they are working on a regional basis. So it's a reason why you have, in Africa, West Africa with the CDAO zone, UMOR, on the central with Cameroon. Morocco is joining the Union Africa recently, but they are also joining the CDAO zone. So they are moving and try to create more global economic zone. The second magic word is diversification. You need more industry diversification, especially Algeria is working on this topic, but also country like Ivory Coast, because Ivory Coast is very linked and dependent on agriculture, and with the cacao, price decline, they need to find other, way to develop their industry, and the same for Morocco, Tunisia, and so forth. Two magic words: integration, diversification.
And I'll throw questions open. Of course, we have friends and followers and curious people from around the world watching on live stream. It's a great opportunity to take the temperature of what CEOs are thinking. Do we have any questions here in the audience? We have a microphone over to our friends in the third row. Justin, remind us your name and where you're from.
Justin Brown, I'm a journalist of City Press. Just wanted to ask, what is the temperature? I just want to ask the PwC gentleman. What is the view of the company of South Africa at this stage, given downgrades, change in cabinet, new finance minister? What is your impressions of the new finance minister, if you don't mind? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, if I can wind the clock back a little bit longer than the most recent events, the ability, I think, for the first time really for Labour, business and government to sit around a single table and discuss some of the issues, was a significant step forward, I think, from a South African perspective. Nonetheless, some of the political interventions and reappointments, resulted in some of those downgrades, and it's now a question to see if that same resilience that tried to stop that downgrade, dissipates, or if it in fact remains a powerful force in the fortunes of the country. So, depending on one's look, you could have argued that the fall could have been much further, or the cut in terms of exchange rate could have been much deeper. I think, on average, people would suggest that it's not been as pronounced as originally anticipated, and yes, it's a work in progress. There's still a rating agency out there wanting to make final decisions around that. But I would argue that the resilience that has been shown by the country at large, and I don't want to single out business or Labour or government, only. The combination of the three has probably once again shown that there is more to South Africa than a single decision a single negative indicator. So as a firm, we remain positive. We remain to invest in Africa and in South Africa in particular. And we're here for the long haul, and we see this as a journey, and this is a particular point in time, and we'll get through this and we'll move on. As an overall statement, would we have liked to have seen a more stable environment? Clearly, we would have had. These are the cards we dealt with at the moment, and we play them accordingly as a country and as PwC.
I'll take the next question. Sorry, please.
Let me just add to that point. I mean, I think in our environment, and this is not a PwC view, I think it's for all of us to see. We're seeing now fundamental changes in government. We're seeing fundamental changes in the way business operates and the way society reacts. Business now, all of a sudden, we're seeing these forums, Business Leadership South Africa, both Dion and I are members of Business Leadership South Africa, where that voice is now being heard on a collective basis. Society are out in the streets, they having their say, and I think government are now listening. And maybe since the first time since democracy, my view is that those three are now aligning with one another, and each are listening to the other.
We had a question from the gentleman in the front row.
Sihle Mabuso, freelance journalist based here in Durban.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Could you just give us your name? Speak up a little.
Sihle Mabuso, I'm a freelance journalist based here in Durban. What's your view on radical economic transformation?
Radical economic transformation. This is a South Africa-focused question. So, Hein, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I think, as a starting point, the globalization or independence in South Africa or Africa integration share the pie in an appropriate way, and I think there would be few that would argue that it's not skewed, and remains to be skewed today. So, if that is what radical economic transformation has in mind, I think as a direction of travel, it would be something I think most South Africans would agree with. It is about how you get there. So at the moment, the details of what that means is pretty sketchy. It's a term out there, that I understand might have been coined by somebody that's not necessarily an economist per se. And I think it's a question of us, working to grow the economy. If you ask me what the single biggest thing is that keeps me awake at night, there's 1 million entrants into the market, the schooling system, on an annual basis, without a realistic chance of finding a sustainable job. And I think as a country, if we don't address that primary concern, all of the other things we're talking about will be on the fringe of the issue per se. So, I think the economy needs to grow. It needs to grow inclusively. There perhaps needs to be a much different lens in terms of who benefits out of that action, and ultimately, if we don't create a larger workforce that has a stake in this economy, I think the country will always, be on the risky side, for lack of a better term.
Okay, a couple more minutes left, so let's do these questions rather quickly, please. The gentleman at the back first, and then we'll get the microphone over to the lady here.
Thank you. Raman Yang from CGTN. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. My question's Kenya focused. We've seen a slew of pretty negative data coming out of the country in the last 12, 14 months. Inflation is at 11.48% for April. Last year's jobs numbers are pretty bad, 57,900 new jobs created in the formal sector. And of course, with interest rates being capped, we've seen a steep decline in private sector credit growth as well. Amidst all that noise, and keeping in mind that there's the election coming in August, is there any optimism for future growth among CEOs? And if so, what sectors are they bullish on?
So that's optimism in Kenya. And just hold your thoughts there. We'll get this lady's questions, and we'll take both at the same time.
I'm Freedom Demo from CGTN Africa. It's based in Kenya. I'm his colleague. So I had the challenges you're talking about that CEOs are facing. And I was kind of hoping maybe someone would talk about climate change, because the southern part of Africa has been ravished by floods, and most of the countries in East Africa have been ravished by drought. So I'm thinking, is that a problem for CEOs? How are they mitigating that, or just something around that?
great question. So, first of all, optimism for Kenya, and where are those nodes of optimism? Climate change, why isn't it the risk? You know, funnily enough, it's on the program here. We're going to be discussing it in one of the next sessions, because the famine is, you know, a terrible situation, and we want to make sure this meeting we get it covered. But first of all, let's go to East Africa and Kenya.
Okay. Thanks for your questions. In fact, there were several questions, very, very good questions. Yes, inflation is creeping up, and you'll be aware that a very major contributor to that has been the food prices, because of the extended drought that Kenya in particular has suffered over the last few months. One would only hope that we will get rain and that the price of some of the very basic commodities will come down. Linked to that are some of the measures that government tried to introduce in the recent finance bill to reduce the cost of some basic essentials, such as maize meal, etc. But it also speaks to the point about relying on rain-fed agriculture. And, you know, Kenya and other parts of Africa must invest in agriculture that removes that over-reliance, because, you know, you can never really determine how long the rains will come, or it will take them to come or not come. So that speaks to the bit about inflation. My hope is that it is temporary, and that in the long run, if you take a 12-month period, we'll see averages that are not dissimilar to what we experienced last year, assuming that the rains come, and indications are that the rains are now with us. Regulation can be bad, but it can also be good. You made reference to the interest rate capping. I don't want to, you know, indicate whether I'm for or against, you know, a blanket capping by regulation. I'm, however, a believer of free market forces. And there's something to be said about free market forces, because then those that can actually command cheaper credit can get cheaper credit, as opposed to paying the same price as everybody else, because that has been, that's what the regulation has prescribed. But why I say regulation is not a bad thing is that even when we are talking to CEOs, and you'll see it in the publication, one of the things that CEOs want to know about a country is that they know what to expect. They know what the ground rules are. What's the regime? What are the rules? What are the rules of the game? So there are aspects of regulation that are not a bad thing. Rate capping is not one of those that I would classify as positive in terms of predictability. I think it has its own restrictions. When it comes to elections, you know, we are in a democratic society, so we do need elections. If we didn't have regular elections, I think we would be talking of other problems. I think it's how a country prepares for elections so that it is not such a major event that slows down economy, and it takes a year before, you know, things then get going. In my view, it's good to have elections and to have them in a regular manner, but it's how you prepare for them and how you ensure that business is not disrupted that is worrying. Am I concerned about elections and the general environment in Kenya? I think there will be excitement around, but I think for a business that is looking to invest in that market, there should be nothing really to stop them from investing if their only consideration was the election. I hope that answers your question.
Dion, briefly, I think you're the best place to talk about climate change.
Sure, and the lady's absolutely right, Oliver. So I only mentioned, you know, the top 3 risks, and there are up to 10 risks and threats that CEOs were asked on and quizzed on, and certainly climate change does appear on that list. So you're absolutely right, and we have seen it, you know, particularly in this part of the world, where on top of, you know, the problem of being a very water-scarce region, the last 2.5 odd years have seen us experiencing probably the most severe drought on record. And even today, certain areas of the country, such as the Western Cape, have very low dam capacity levels. So water is really a big issue that's had a negative impact on our agri-industry in particular. And if you think of the fact that, this continent, which already, despite the fact that it has so much arable land, this is a continent that imports a significant amount of its food. So from a food security perspective, certainly climate change is something that every single CEO should be worrying about.
Well, we could go on all afternoon. It's a fascinating topic, and all of these discussions will be had over the next couple of days in the sessions that are to follow. Don't forget, this is the first press conference, so I'd like to thank my panel for kicking it off in such great style. Thank you all for joining us. This session is now closed.